Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. The UK is set to host a coalition of the willing, a virtual summit to discuss the future of the Ukraine conflict. Attendees include members of NATO, the EU and Canada. Hamas says it will only free US-Israeli hostage if the second phase of the ceasefire is implemented. This comes after the US rebuts Hamas's entirely impractical demands. US President Donald Trump praises talks held with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the US proposed ceasefire deal. Trump described them as good and productive after US envoy met with Putin on Thursday. Kiev's Air Force has stated that it destroyed 130 out of 178 Russian drones overnight. It also added that the other 38 drones launched had been locationally lost. The Prime Minister of Iraq says the head of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria has been killed in an operation by the Iraqi National Intelligence Service. US President Donald Trump also reacts on his social media platform Truth Social. Russian President Putin calls for Ukrainian surrender in the Kursk region after Russia claims control of another settlement. Ukraine reports repelling multiple Russian offensives. US Congress averts a government shutdown just hours before the funding deadline. This comes after the Senate approves a House-passed spending bill that exposes deep rifts within the Democratic Party. Former central banker Mark Carney is sworn in as Canada's new Prime Minister. Carney forcefully pushes back against threats of a US annexation as his members of his cabinet also take oaths of office. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is preparing to convene what he has called a coalition of the willing as he seeks to concrete commitments from around 25 world leaders today. Starmer's goal is to secure continued support for Ukraine and intensify global pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin to bring an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Starmer's call comes after accusing Putin of being insecure about efforts towards a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed cautious optimism over a potential 30-day ceasefire brokered by the US, though he warned that Russia would likely delay the agreement. Zelensky emphasized the difficulty of resolving territorial disputes, including Russia's demand for Crimea, and stressed the need for future security guarantees, including air defense coverage. Let's take a listen to what Zelensky had to say.
Багато дипломатії, багато перемовин, які можуть наблизити мир. Зараз на столі американська пропозиція безумовної тиші у небі, на морі та на фронті. Україна сприймає цю пропозицію. І з цього можемо розпочати швидкий рух до гарантованої безпеки, до завершення цієї війни, до надійного миру. Наші команди дуже добре попрацювали на зустрічі в Саудівській Аравії.
We are now joined by Joshua Barnes, anchor and correspondent for NewsX World. Joshua, thank you very much for joining us. Joshua, this meeting hosted by the UK obviously comes amidst support for the UK and other European nations for Ukraine. What do we know about this meeting? Joshua?
Yes, so Thomas, we know that this meeting is going to be held virtually. We know that this meeting is a continuation of one that happened 2 weeks ago in Lancaster House. European nations, NATO nations, but also the leaders from Australia, New Zealand, Canada are also expected. Now, it's a continuation, as I mentioned already, of those discussions that have been had before, but we've had a lot of updates in the previous 2 weeks. So this is a show of unity from those nations to show support for Ukraine, but also look at options over suggestions that have been made by the US. Now, we know that the ceasefire deal is currently with Russia, with Vladimir Putin. There are questions that are being raised whether this deal will actually be signed. Some experts say that it will be better for Russia if they don't, given gains that are being made. However, it is really important that the European nations continue their show of unity behind Ukraine, and this meeting is a continuation of that.
Joshua, what are the specific aims of this virtual meeting today between all these world leaders?
So they're looking, of course, at support for Ukraine. After the meeting at Lancaster House, there was mention of aid, weapons deals, security, after the US, of course, pulled aid to the Ukrainian country. We're also potentially looking at work going in, geopolitical work going in to put pressure on the United States to try and push this deal forward. US envoys, of course, Steve Witkoff was in Russia to speak with Vladimir Putin. Those conversations took place, but the ball really is with Russia and in their court. So at this point, it is putting pressure on Russia to try and come to a ceasefire agreement. Moving past that, any talk of a future peace in the region, of course, will depend on this ceasefire deal. Vladimir Putin's been very clear that he doesn't want European troops in Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to become part of NATO if there is to be a ceasefire deal. But these conversations will still be had. Europe wants to make sure that Ukraine's security remains in place, even if a ceasefire deal is made. There's a very long line, very long front line between the two nations. So securing that security is something that will be key.
Joshua Barnes, thank you very much for joining us. Staying on the same topic, Ukraine's air defences successfully intercepted 130 out of 178 drones launched by Russia in a massive overnight assault. Kiev's Air Force reported that an additional 38 drones were locationally lost, likely due to electronic jamming. Russian forces also fired 2 Alexander M ballistic missiles from the Kursk Oblast. The attack originated from multiple locations across Russia and occupied Crimea, with drones shot down several Ukrainian regions, including Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa and Zaporizhzhia. Officials say the scale of this assault emphasizes the ongoing efforts to weaken Ukraine's defenses as the war intensifies. The Ukrainian military remains on high alert as air raid sirens continue to sound across the country, with authorities urging civilians to stay vigilant and seek shelter when necessary. Staying now in Europe, with tens of thousands of people from across Serbia are expected to gather in Belgrade for a large anti-corruption rally. This marks the culmination of months of protests that have weakened the grip of President Alexander Vučić. The unrest, sparked by a deadly roof collapse at a station in Novi Sad last November, has now reached a boiling point. Protesters blame rampant corruption for the tragedy, which claimed 14 lives. As protesters grow, the movement's demands for accountability and transparency institutions continue to challenge the government's authority, with many hoping to see seismic changes. Despite mounting pressure, Vučić has rejected calls for his resignation, declaring that no one will force him out of office. This is what he said.
Država Srbija preduzeće sve neophodne mere da se obezbedi mir. Oni koji budu narušavali mir biće uhapšeni i strogo kažnjeni. Samo da bude potpuno jasno da ne pristajem na ucene, ne pristajem na pritiske, ja sam predsjednik Srbije. I neću da dozvolim da ulica određuje pravila u ovoj zemlji i neću da dozvolim da ulica određuje katastrofalnu budućnost za ovu zemlju.
A Finnish court on Friday sentenced a Russian neo-Nazi to life in prison on war crimes charges stemming from a 2014 clash in Ukraine, with Kiev hailing the ruling as a key milestone. The Russian embassy in Finland said in a statement that the verdict of the Finnish judiciary provokes nothing but deep outrage and indignation. Russia also called the case against him as shameful and politically motivated. The Helsinki District Court found Vojislav Tordon, a commander of the Russian neo-Nazi paramilitary group Ruslich, guilty of 4 different war crimes committed in eastern Ukraine. His group was also found to have killed and injured a soldier. He was arrested by Finnish police at the Helsinki airport in July 2023 as he was headed for Nice in southern France with his family. Reportedly, Petrovsky managed to enter Finland despite an EU-wide entry ban with the help of a new identity and his wife's student status in the Nordic country. According to the Hamas-run Gazan Health Ministry, a deadly Israeli drone strike in Gaza has killed 4 Palestinians, while another was killed by Israel's Navy off the coast. In southern Rafah, a tank and a gunboat has been reported. Meanwhile, Hamas has announced it will only release Israeli-American captive Edan Alexander along with the bodies of 4 other captives if Israel implements the existing ceasefire agreement. The group calls it an exceptional deal aimed at resuming stalled talks. According to a senior Hamas official, the talks over the ceasefire's second phase must start on the day of the release and conclude within 50 days. The situation remains tense as both sides hold firm on their conditions. We are now once again joined by Joshua Barnes, anchor and correspondent for NewsX. Well, Joshua, what can you tell me about the recent incidents involving in this Gaza ceasefire crisis?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, we have seen action from the Israeli military now in Gaza. Of course, the situation around hostages is also very difficult, a current impasse before the second phase of negotiations begins for the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire. But what we are looking at is a situation that neither side is happy with. People are dying in Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry report that 98 have died since the ceasefire began. Meanwhile, Israel is saying that the hostages need to be returned. And conversations have been ongoing, conversations in Doha involving Arab nations, involving US envoys. But it seems at the moment we're currently sort of in the same situation that we have been for a few days now. While these talks are happening, neither side is happy with what is happening, and the US-Israeli hostage that you mentioned there is potentially key to this. Now, Hamas and the US had direct talks, and it involved this hostage, who Hamas said that they would release. Israel, of course, aren't happy with this. They want to see a plan, and a clear plan, that will see all of the hostages dead and alive released as soon as possible. The situation, of course, is tense, is fractious, and conversations are ongoing. They're not coming to a resolution. So it's one to keep an eye on, but as it is, it's been the same for a few days now.
Thank you very much, Joshua Barnes, for joining us. Moving on now, Elon Musk announced that SpaceX's Starship will depart from Mars at the end of 2026, carrying Tesla's humanoid robot Optimus. If the mission is successful, human landings could follow as soon as 2029 through 2031 is more likely a timeline. Starship, which is the world's most powerful rocket, is central to Musk's goal of colonizing Mars. NASA is also relying on a modified version of the Starship as a lunar lander for its Artemis program, which aims to return astronauts to the moon this decade. However, deep space missions can proceed. SpaceX must demonstrate that Starship is reliable, safe for crewed missions, and capable of in-orbit refueling. This month's test flight ended in an explosion after booster separation, repeating issues from its prior test. The FAA has ordered an investigation before Starship can fly again, marking another challenge in Musk's ambitious plan for interplanetary travel. The Trump administration is weighing a major travel ban that could impact citizens from 41 countries. A leaked memo outlines 3 groups facing different levels of visa restrictions. The first group, including Afghanistan, Iran, and North Korea, could see a full visa suspension. The second group may face limits on tourist and student visas. A third group has 60 days to meet US security demands or risk losing visa access. The plan is not final yet, and officials say changes are possible. More details ahead. Moving on now, on Saturday, multiple Russian military planes entered South Korea's air defense identification zone off the country's east coast, according to South Korea's Joint Chief of Staff. The planes briefly entered the zone before leaving without further incident. The Cadiz is a sensitive airspace where foreign aircraft are monitored, such as intrusions are typically met with heightened vigilance by South Korean forces. Although similar violations have occurred in the past, this latest event underscored the ongoing regional tensions, particularly concerning military activities near the Korean peninsula. South Korea has not yet disclosed specific details about the number of Russian planes involved or their intentions during the brief incursion. Mark Carney, an economist and political newcomer, took office as Canada's Prime Minister. He replaced Justin Trudeau just after winning the Liberal Party leadership in a landslide. Carney promised Canada would never become a part of the United States. He called for Donald Trump's idea of making Canada the 51st state crazy. Carney inherits a trade war with Trump, who has threatened tariffs that could hurt Canada's economy. Still, Carney said he looks forward to working with the US president. His first move as Prime Minister was scrapping the consumer carbon tax, a key policy under Trudeau. The tax had become unpopular amid high inflation. Several of Trudeau's ministers kept their jobs in Carney's cabinet. Next week, Carney will visit the UK and France to strengthen Canada's European ties amid tensions with the US.
I, Mark Carney, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trust reposed in me as Prime Minister.
Well, I've been clear, personally I've been clear, the ministers behind me, I think to an individual, when asked, have been clear, that we will never, ever, in any way, shape, or form, be part of the United States. America is not Canada.
Russian President Vladimir Putin urged Ukrainian troops in the Kursk to surrender, promising their safety if they do so. He acknowledged US President Donald Trump's request to spare their lives as Russian forces retake the region. Putin also mentioned efforts to rebuild relations with the US after strains under the previous administration. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, however, expressed doubts about Putin's intentions, accusing him of undermining peace talks and imposing unacceptable ceasefire conditions. Zelensky stressed Ukraine's desire for peace but highlighted the ongoing loss of lives during the war. He called on the US and other nations to exert pressure on Russia to end the conflict, which has been ongoing since 2014. Although Ukraine accepted the US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, tensions remain high as Russia works towards regaining control of the Kursk. Here's what Vladimir Putin had to say.
С пониманием относимся к призыву президента Трампа руководствоваться в отношении этих военнослужащих соображениями гуманитарного характера. В этой связи подчеркну, что в случае сложения оружия и сдачи в плен им будет гарантирована жизнь и достойное обращение в соответствии с нормами международного права и
US President Donald Trump departed from Joint Base Andrews on Friday, March the 14th, heading to his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. Joining him were Tesla CEO Elon Musk and his son. Before boarding Air Force One, Trump spoke to reporters, expressing optimism about the situation in Russia. He mentioned pretty good vibes coming out of Russia, suggesting that a deal on the Ukraine war could be on the horizon. Trump also praised Senator Chuck Schumer for his role in the Senate vote on the stopgap spending bill, stating that he did the right thing. Here's what Trump said.
From the standpoint about a ceasefire and ultimately a deal, some pretty good vibes coming out of Russia.
In a fiery speech at the US Department of Justice, Donald Trump targeted journalists, judges, prosecutors and member of the Biden administration, calling for accountability. Trump claimed the 2024 election gave him a mandate to investigate those he believes committed abuses under Joe Biden's presidency. He doubled down on his false claims about the 2020 election, labeling it rigged and calling those responsible to be jailed. Trump also threatened political opponents, including former allies, with legal action. The speech is sparking concerns over potential retaliation if he returns to power.
So now, as the chief law enforcement officer in our country, I will insist upon and demand full and complete accountability for the wrongs and abuses that have occurred. The American people have given us a mandate like few people thought possible.
Staying in the US now, US Congress has managed to avert a government shutdown just in the nick of time. After weeks of tense negotiations, the Senate approved a crucial funding bill backed by President Trump. The bill, which had already passed through the House, will keep federal agencies funded through September. The midnight deadline was looming, but the last-minute deal stopped shutdown preparations and spared over 800,000 workers from being furloughed. The move required rare cooperation between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, highlighting the high stakes of this vote.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 46. The bill is passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made.
On this vote, the yeas are 62, the nays are 38. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to.
China successfully launched a Long March 2D rocket on Saturday, placing the Gaojing 02 remote sensing satellite into orbit. The mission also deployed Taitian 23 satellite. The rocket lifted off at 12:11 p.m. Beijing time from Jiaquan Satellite Launch Center in northwest China, marking another milestone in the country's growing space ambitions. Gaojing 02 is expected to enhance Earth observation capabilities, while Taitian 23 will support various research and monitoring applications. This launch marks the 564th flight of the Long March series, a key component of China's expanding space program. The country has been rapidly increasing its satellite deployments, strengthening its presence in both commercial and scientific space exploration. China's space agency continues to push forward with its ambitious agenda, including lunar exploration and a planned Mars sample return mission, solidifying its position as a major player in global space advancements. The US Department of Energy has called South Korea a sensitive country effective April the 15th. This comes after Seoul's brief martial law declaration and renewed debate over its nuclear policy. Before leaving office in January, Biden's administration placed South Korea on the lowest tier of the sensitive countries list. The US has not explained the move but confirmed no new restrictions on bilateral scientific and technological cooperation. Seoul says it is in close talks with Washington to minimize any impact. South Korea joins a list that includes China, Russia, Iran, heightening concerns over its nuclear stance. More from South Korea, anti-Yoon Suk-yeol protesters held rallies in central Seoul on Saturday as the embattled South Korean president faces being removed from office if the court upholds parliament's impeachment. This came after his supporters also held a rally in central Seoul on Saturday. The South Korean president walked out of the detention center where he was being held on March the 8th after prosecutors decided not to appeal in a court's decision to cancel the impeached leader's arrest warrant on insurrection charges. His criminal and impeachment trials have since continued over his short-lived imposition of martial law on December the 3rd. Former Lebanese Prime Minister Hassan Diab has praised China's higher education system, calling it a driving force behind the country's technological and economic success. Speaking in Guangzhou, Diab highlighted China's strategic investment in world-class universities and research centers, comparing it to other nations that have risen to global economic power. He also stressed the importance of international education exchanges to foster cultural understanding. Diab expressed admiration for China's rapid advancement and thanked the Chinese people for their warm hospitality during his visit. The United States has expelled South Africa's ambassador to Washington, Ibrahim Rasool. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared him no longer welcome in the country. Rubio accused Rasool of being a race-baiting politician and expressed strong opposition to his views on President Donald Trump. This rare move follows growing tensions between the two nations. Rubio's criticism stemmed from remarks Rasool made about Trump and the MAGA movement during an online lecture. South Africa's president called the decision regrettable but reaffirmed the country's commitment to maintaining a strong relationship with the US. The US Justice Department is investigating possible violations of terrorism laws during protests over the Gaza war at Columbia University. The protests, which followed the Hamas attack on Israel and the Israeli response, led to a series of demonstrations on the university campus. The government claims some of the actions during the protests may have crossed into the lines of terrorism-related activities. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stated that the investigation is part of a broader effort to combat anti-Semitism in the US and is seen as part of President Trump's push against pro-Palestinian activism. Let's take a listen to what Deputy Attorney General had to say.
The President promised that under his watch, we will no longer stand by while universities tolerate and facilitate anti-Semitism and support of terrorism on their campuses. The department's recent actions, which hopefully you've seen at Columbia University in coordination with our law enforcement agency partners, are part of the administration's mission to end anti-Semitism in this country. Just last night, we worked with the Department of Homeland Security to execute search warrants from an investigation into Columbia University for harboring and concealing illegal aliens on its campus. That investigation is ongoing, and we are also looking at whether Columbia's handling of earlier incidents violated civil rights laws and included terrorism crimes. This is long overdue. Let me be clear. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It has the blood of American citizens on its hands, innocent victims, many of whom are citizens of this country, have died because of Hamas's actions. Any person engaging in material support of terrorism will be prosecuted.
And that is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from across the world.